Earl Bodine had a reputation in Boone County, Missouri, that preceded him to any conversation in which his name came up. The reputation was not for cruelty, because Earl was not a cruel man. It was for standards, which was different. Though people who had worked for him and quit by noon tended to describe the distinction in terms that did not always make the difference clear. He was 74 years old and had been farming the same 210 acres outside of Hallsville since he was 30, when his parents had handed him the operation with the understanding that he would run it the way they had run it, which was correctly. He had done this. He had run it correctly for 44 years, which meant he knew precisely how every task on the farm was supposed to be done, and in what order, and with what tools, and at what pace, and with what level of attention to what the task was telling you while you were doing it. He was not interested in approximations. He was not interested in people who did the main part of a job and skipped the finishing part because the finishing part was less visible. He was not interested in being explained to about how something was usually done somewhere else, because the somewhere else was not his farm, and the usually was not what he was asking for. He had gone through 11 hired hands in the previous 4 years. Not all of them had quit by noon. 2 had lasted a week. 1 had lasted 3 weeks before leaving for a job in Columbia that paid less, but that the young man told his friends offered significantly less opportunity for being told that his fence post was not plumb. Earl had heard about this secondhand and had considered the characterization accurate. The fence post had not been plumb. By the spring of 2019, Earl had arrived at a position that he described to his neighbor Frank Gully as moderately inconvenient, and that Frank, who had known Earl for 40 years, translated internally as genuinely difficult. Earl's left knee had been operated on in January and was recovering slower than expected, which meant the full range of spring fieldwork was beyond what he could manage alone, which meant he needed help, which meant he needed to hire someone who would not quit. He had put a handwritten card on the bulletin board at the Hallsville Farm Supply and Hardware, and one at the feed store in Centralia, and one at the county extension office, and had listed the daily rate, which was fair, and the work, which was the work, and had received 4 inquiries. 3 of the 4 had come for a first day of work and had not returned for the second. The 4th inquiry had not come through the card. On a Wednesday morning in late April, Earl came out of the farmhouse at 5:30 to find a man sitting on the porch step. The man was 52 years old, though he looked somewhat older than that, with the specific physical presentation of someone who had been living outside for a considerable period, which was to say a level of weathering that went beyond what farming or outdoor work produced, and that came from the combination of outdoor exposure and irregular sleep and irregular food, and the specific kind of exhaustion that did not respond to a single night's rest. He had a backpack beside him and the kind of stillness about him of a man who had spent several months learning to occupy as little space as possible without disappearing entirely. His name was Curtis Wren. He was from Kansas City. He had been a machine shop foreman for 19 years, had lost the job when the shop closed in 2018, had lost the apartment 4 months after that when the unemployment ran out, had spent the past 8 months in a sequence of shelters and outdoor accommodations that had brought him eventually to a truck stop outside of Centralia, where he had heard from another man passing through that there was a farmer outside of Hallsville who needed help and paid in cash. He said all of this to Earl on the porch step, with the directness of a man who had learned that the situation was what it was, and that obscuring it served no one, and that if Earl wanted to send him away, it was his prerogative, and Curtis had no argument with that. But that if Earl was willing to give him a day's work, he would do whatever Earl asked him to do and would do it correctly, and would not leave until it was done. Earl had looked at him for a moment. He said he had been through 11 men in 4 years and none of them had lasted. He said his expectations were high, and the work was real, and that he was not going to lower either of those things for any consideration, including the other man's circumstances. Curtis said he understood that. He said he was not asking for accommodation. He was asking for the same day's work and the same day's standard as anyone else. Earl had gone inside and come back with a pair of rubber boots in approximately Curtis's size and said to put them on and follow him. The first task of the day was fence line repair on the east pasture, where Winter had heaved 4 posts and bent one section of woven wire in a way that made the section unreliable for cattle. Earl showed Curtis the post driver and the post puller and the fencing tools, and described exactly how the repair was to be done, the specific depth the new posts were to be driven, the specific tension on the wire, the specific way the splices were to be made. He said nothing twice. He watched Curtis set up for the first post and did not say anything while Curtis worked. Curtis worked slowly but correctly. He had never driven a fence post before, but he had spent 19 years foreman in a machine shop, which meant he understood tools and he understood the principle of working to a specification rather than to an approximation. And he applied that understanding to the fence post with the full attention of a man who was doing something for the first time and intended to do it correctly rather than adequately. When he drove the first post and Earl checked it with the level and said nothing, Curtis took the silence as approval and moved to the second post with the same attention. They worked the fence line until noon. Earl said nothing instructional after the initial demonstration because nothing instructional was needed, which was a condition Earl had not encountered in the previous 4 years of hired help, and which he registered without comment by moving to the next section of fence that needed attention, rather than standing at the first section reviewing what had been done. At noon, Earl went to the farmhouse and came back with 2 sandwiches and 2 bottles of water, and gave one of each to Curtis and sat on the tailgate of the truck and ate his own without discussing whether this constituted a break or how long it would last. Curtis sat on the ground near the fence line and ate his sandwich with the specific focus of a man who had been eating irregularly for 8 months, and for whom a sandwich in the middle of a day's work was not a routine thing, but who was not going to make a display of that. After the noon meal, Earl said the afternoon would be spent on the baler, which needed a specific repair to the twine mechanism that had been causing problems in the fall, and that he had been putting off through the winter, and that needed to be done before first cutting. He described the repair in the same specific way he had described the fence work, what needed to come apart, and in what order, and what the reassembled mechanism needed to do when it was done. He said he had the parts. Curtis said he had mechanical experience. Earl said he had heard that and was about to find out if it was true. The baler repair took 3 hours. Curtis approached it the way he approached machinery that he was working on for the first time, which was to understand the system before he modified it, spending the first 20 minutes examining how the twine mechanism was assembled and what it was supposed to do before he touched any of the fasteners. Earl watched this without comment and without impatience, which surprised Curtis when he noticed it, because most people who were watching someone learn a piece of equipment for the first time showed their impatience within 10 minutes, and most of the time the impatience got in the way of the learning. The mechanism was disassembled, cleaned, adjusted, and reassembled. Curtis ran it through a test cycle and found one thing he had not gotten right, and disassembled the relevant section and corrected it, and reassembled it, and ran it through the cycle again. Earl had not pointed out the error. He had watched Curtis find it himself, which was what Earl considered the correct order of events. When the baler mechanism ran through its full test cycle correctly 3 consecutive times, Earl said, "All right," and that was the entirety of his assessment. They worked until 6 in the evening. The fence line on the east pasture was done. The baler was repaired. The stock tank in the north pasture that Earl had mentioned in passing at 2 in the afternoon as something that needed attention had been cleaned and refilled, which Curtis had done after finishing the baler without being asked, because he had heard it mentioned and because it was visible from where he was working, and because it needed to be done. At 6, Earl said the day rate was what the card had said and paid Curtis in cash from his wallet at the farmhouse door. He asked Curtis where he was staying. Curtis said he had been camping at the county park outside of Centralia. Earl was quiet for a moment. He said there was a bunkhouse behind the equipment shed that had not been used since 1988, but that had a cot and a propane heater that worked if you lit the pilot correctly and that Curtis was welcome to use it for as long as he was working here. Curtis said he appreciated that. Earl said he wanted Curtis here at 5:30 in the morning if he intended to come back. Curtis said he would be there. He was there at 5:15. The following weeks established the pattern that would govern the partnership for the next several years. Earl expected everything done correctly and did not revise that expectation for any reason. And Curtis did everything correctly because the work required it, and because doing things correctly was the only relationship with work that made sense to Curtis now, having spent 8 months in a situation where correctness in the abstract sense had nothing to apply itself to. The farm had things that needed to be done in specific ways at specific times for specific reasons, and those reasons were not arbitrary and could be understood if you paid enough attention, and Curtis paid enough attention. He made mistakes. Earl identified them without drama once, in precise terms, and moved on. Curtis corrected them. The corrections were permanent, not because Earl was a memorable teacher, but because Curtis was a man who understood that making the same mistake twice was a failure of attention rather than of capability, and whose attention, after 8 months of having nothing that required it at the level the farm required it, was entirely available. Earl did not ask about Kansas City. He did not ask about the machine shop or the apartment or the 8 months. This was not in curiosity on Earl's part. It was his understanding, developed across 44 years of farming and 7 decades of life, that people told you what they needed you to know, when they were ready to tell you, and that asking before they were ready was a form of imposition that he was not willing to make. The farm was the common ground. The farm was what they had. Curtis had been at the farm for 6 weeks when Earl's left knee gave out completely on a Thursday afternoon while he was getting down from the tractor, and he went down in the field lane in a way that was slow and deliberate enough to avoid injury, but that made it clear that he was not getting up without help. Curtis was in the equipment shed 40 yards away. He heard the sound and came across the field lane at a run that was not the sprint of a young man, but was the determined pace of a man covering ground with purpose. And he helped Earl up and got him to the farmhouse and sat him at the kitchen table and looked at the knee with the steady assessment of someone evaluating a problem rather than panicking about it. He called Miriam, which was Earl's daughter in Jefferson City, whose number was on the notepad by the phone where Earl kept the numbers that mattered. He gave her the information she needed, without drama. He then got ice from the freezer and wrapped it and put it on the knee and made Earl keep it there while they waited for Miriam to arrive. Earl did not say anything about the efficiency of this. He sat at the kitchen table with the ice on his knee and looked at Curtis from across the table and thought about the 11 men before this one and about the specific quality of attention that had been brought to that fence post on the first morning, and that had been present in every hour of work in the 6 weeks since, and about what it meant that this attention was now being applied to him rather than to the farm's equipment or infrastructure, and that the quality of attention was identical. Miriam arrived in an hour and took Earl to the doctor in Columbia, where it was determined that the replacement knee needed a second procedure, which was scheduled for the following month. She stayed at the farm that evening and met Curtis and asked him about himself, which Earl had not done. And Curtis told her about the machine shop in Kansas City and the 8 months in something close to the terms he had used on the porch step in April, with the directness of a man who had learned to describe his situation plainly. Miriam had listened and had asked a few practical questions and had thanked Curtis for what he had done with the farm and for the phone call that afternoon. She had gone inside to talk to Earl and had come back out to the bunkhouse where Curtis was and had said that Earl wanted her to ask whether Curtis would be willing to manage the operation while Earl was recovering from the procedure. Curtis had said yes. He managed the operation through the second knee procedure and the recovery, 6 weeks, doing the work of the farm, with Earl available at the kitchen table as a resource when Curtis had questions, and with the specific quality of management that came from someone who understood how everything worked, because they had been taught it by the person who had designed it, and who had paid close enough attention to that teaching to be able to apply it correctly in the teacher's absence. The first cutting came in on schedule. The cattle rotations ran correctly. The equipment was maintained. Nothing went wrong that Curtis could not address. Earl came back to full work capability in late July and found the farm in the condition he had expected to find it in, which was correct. He did not say this directly. He walked every section of the property on the first morning he was able to, and came back to the farmhouse and said to Curtis that the south fence line needed attention in the section near the creek, which was true, and which was also Earl's way of saying that the rest of it was right. Curtis understood this. He went to the south fence line near the creek. The 2 years that followed settled into the kind of working arrangement that was not easy to describe to people who had not seen it, because it was not a friendship in the conventional sense, and it was not an employment in the conventional sense, and it was not any other category that the available vocabulary handled precisely. It was two men who had found in each other the specific thing each of them needed, which for Earl was someone who could do the work correctly, and for Curtis was work that required being done correctly. And the fit between these two needs was so exact that the arrangement that grew from it had the quality of something that had been designed, rather than arrived at. Curtis had stopped being homeless in any practical sense within the first month at the farm, and had stopped thinking of himself as homeless within the first year, though the transition from one to the other had not been marked by any specific moment that he could identify later. It had happened gradually, the way most real changes happened, through the accumulation of mornings that started at 5:15 and days that had specific work in them, and evenings in the bunkhouse that were quiet rather than anxious, and through the specific relationship with a piece of ground that grew from doing the same tasks on it in the same seasons across years and learning what the ground did in each season and why. He had begun keeping notes on the farm in a small notebook he bought at the Hallsville hardware store in the fall of 2019, the same kind of notes that Earl kept in the office records, field observations and equipment maintenance logs, and the small operational details that were useful to have when a question arose about what had been done and when. Earl had not asked him to keep these notes. He had started them because the work made more sense when it was recorded, and because Earl's records went back to 1975. And Curtis was aware that adding to them was adding to something that had value beyond the current season. Earl had found one of the notebooks in the office one evening in the second winter and had read the entries without comment. The following morning he had shown Curtis where the older records were kept, the boxes of field notebooks going back 44 years, and had said that if Curtis wanted to know how the farm had behaved in any given year, he was welcome to look at the records for that year. Curtis had looked at them. He had spent 3 evenings reading the records from the drought years of 1983 and 1988 and the flood year of 1993, and had come to Earl on the 4th morning with 3 questions about what specific decisions Earl had made in those years and why. Earl had answered all 3 questions in full, not because the questions were instructional in a formal sense, but because they were good questions and deserved complete answers, and because a man who read 44 years of farm records in order to ask 3 specific questions about the decisions they contained was the kind of man whose questions deserved complete answers. Miriam came to the farm every few months and brought her husband and their children and stayed for a weekend, and she had watched the farm and Curtis and her father over the course of those visits with the specific attention of a woman who was paying close attention to something she had not expected, and that was turning out to be better than she could have predicted. She had said to Earl once on a Sunday evening in the 3rd year that she did not know what the arrangement was exactly, but that whatever it was, it seemed to be working. Earl had said it was working because the work was getting done correctly. Miriam had said she thought it might also be because both men had found what they were looking for, and that finding what you were looking for was not always something that happened and was worth noticing when it did. Earl had thought about that for a moment. Then he had said that might be right, He said a man who could set a plumb fence post and rebuild a baler mechanism and manage a 200-acre operation for 6 weeks without a mistake was not something you found every day and was worth keeping. Miriam had said she thought Curtis might say something similar about a man who set standards that were worth meeting. Earl had not said anything to that, but he had gone to the kitchen window and looked out at the bunkhouse light, which was on at 9 in the evening because Curtis was in there reading, probably the farm records, probably the 1977 season which he had been working through, and which had been a difficult year for different reasons than the drought years. And that had things in it that were useful to understand if you intended to be farming this ground for any length of time. Earl intended that Curtis intended that. He had not said so directly. He did not need to. The work said it every morning at 5:15, and every evening when the tools were put away correctly, and the records were updated, and the gate was latched, and the next day's tasks were considered, and the farm went to sleep in the condition it was supposed to go to sleep in. The fence was plumb. The baler ran. The south fence line near the creek had been repaired in the first week and had not needed attention since. That was what mattered. That was, in Earl Bodine's understanding of most things, the whole of what mattered. Frank Gully, who had been Earl's nearest neighbor for 38 of the 44 years Earl had farmed in Boone County, had asked Earl about Curtis the second time he saw him at the farm, which was a Saturday morning in May of 2019, about 3 weeks after Curtis had started. He had seen Curtis in the east pasture finishing the last section of the fence line, working at a pace that Frank could see from the road was the pace of someone who was not in a hurry to stop. He had said to Earl, standing in the driveway, that the man appeared to know what he was doing. Earl had said he did. Frank had asked where he had come from. Earl said Kansas City. Frank said the farms were different in Kansas City, and Earl said he was aware of that and that Curtis had not had any trouble learning what was different. This was as close to a recommendation as Earl Bodine gave for anything, and Frank understood it as such, and the conversation had moved on to the hay rake fitting he was returning and other matters. Earl did not discuss his farm operation with people who were not involved in it, not because he was secretive, but because he had a strong opinion that most conversations about farming substituted words for work, and that his preference was the work. When people at the feed store or the extension meetings asked how the operation was going, he said fine, and they understood that fine from Earl Bodine meant it was being run correctly, and that no further discussion was required. Curtis had been raised in a different culture of conversation, the Kansas City machine shop floor culture, where men talked while they worked, and where the talk was mostly about the work and the machines and the specifications and the problems. He had found the Missouri farm version not difficult to adjust to, because it was the same underlying thing. People engaged in work who talked about the work when the work required talking about it, and did not talk otherwise. The silence between tasks on Earl's farm was not uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people engaged in a shared understanding of what they were doing and why. He had thought about this on a Sunday afternoon in his second month at the farm, sitting outside the bunkhouse in the late afternoon with a cup of coffee, which was a thing he had started doing on Sunday afternoons because Sunday afternoons were the one time Earl did not work, and therefore the one time Curtis did not work. The adjustment to not working had been harder than the adjustment to working, because after 8 months of having nothing to do, the having nothing to do had become familiar in a painful way that he was not entirely comfortable going back to. He thought about Kansas City and the machine shop and what had come after, for the first time in a context where the thinking was retrospective rather than immediate, where he was looking at the 8 months from a stable position rather than from inside them. The machine shop had been the center of his adult life for 19 years. The way Earl's farm was the center of Earl's adult life, the place where he knew what he was doing and why and where the standards were clear and the work responded to correct management. When it closed, he had not had a replacement for it, not just financially, but in terms of what it meant to know how to do something and to have that something require being done. The farm had given him back that specific thing, The experience of having work that required specific knowledge and that responded to the correct application of that knowledge, and that did not accept approximations. He had not known he needed this specifically until he had it again and understood the difference between having it and not having it. Earl had never asked about Kansas City, and Curtis had not told him the longer version, but he thought Earl understood something of it from the way Curtis worked. The way a man who had known correctness for a long time and had then been in a situation where it had no application brought a particular quality of attention to correctness when it was available again. The cattle, 32 head of Angus cows and a bull, had taken to Curtis within the first month. He had not been around cattle before, but he was not afraid of large animals, and he paid attention to what Earl did when he moved through the herd and replicated it well enough that by the 4th week he was moving through them alone. Earl had watched this from the gate on 2 occasions without saying anything, because the watching told him what he needed to know. The summer of 2020 had a July drought that stressed the hay ground and required management decisions that were not in any standard manual, but were in Earl's 44 years of watching what Boone County summers did to alluvial pasture ground when rainfall came in below average. Curtis had managed those decisions during the week of Earl's second knee procedure, using the records from 1983 and 1988 as his baseline. When Earl returned in August and walked the pastures and found the cattle in good condition, he had said the rotation had been managed correctly. Curtis had said he used the drought year records as his baseline. Earl had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said that was the right baseline to use. In Earl Bodine's economy of acknowledgement, this was a significant thing to say. They had been working together for 5 years by the spring of 2024. The 210 acres ran as well as it had ever run, the hay operation consistent, the cattle operation profitable in the specific modest way that a well-managed Angus operation in Boone County was profitable, the equipment maintained, and the records current, and the fences plumb. Miriam had asked Earl directly, on a visit in the fall of 2023, whether he had thought about what happened to the farm in the longer term. Earl said he had. She asked what he had concluded. He said his intention was to establish an arrangement that would allow Curtis to continue the operation and eventually own it, structured in a way that was fair to the farm and to Curtis, and that acknowledged what 5 years of correctly done work was worth. Miriam had said, "Dad, I think that is exactly right." Earl had said the farm needed to go to someone who knew how to run it correctly. He said he had spent 44 years building something that was worth running correctly, and that handing it to someone who did not know how was not an option he intended to entertain. Curtis had found out about it the way he found out about most things Earl did that concerned him, which was from Earl, directly at the kitchen table. Earl had said he wanted to discuss the longer-term arrangements for the farm when Curtis had time for a proper conversation. Curtis had said he had time now. They had talked for 2 hours. At the end, Curtis had said the arrangement was fair and that he would talk to a lawyer of his own before agreeing to the specifics, which Earl said was the correct thing to do. He had gone to the bunkhouse that evening and sat on the cot with the coffee cup and looked at the shelf with the farm records and thought about the porch step in April of 2019 and the rubber boots in approximately his size and the fence post and the level. He had thought about what 5 years of mornings at 5:15 had built and what it had built in him as well as in the farm. The specific competence that came from doing specific things correctly for long enough that the doing became part of what you were, rather than part of what you were trying to do. He was not the man who had sat on the porch step in 2019, not in the obvious ways, but in the more important ways. The ways that had to do with what a person was for and what they were capable of and what they had to offer the world when the world gave them the conditions in which to offer it. Those things had not been gone in 2019. They had been without application. The farm had given them application. Earl had given them the standard they needed to be worth applying. The notebook on the shelf was the fourth he had kept. The records it would eventually join went back to 1975, 44 years of Earl's handwriting, and would continue in Curtis's hand in the same format and in the same spirit. which was the spirit of correctness, of paying the right kind of attention to a piece of ground and writing down what it showed you. He made a note in the fourth notebook, before turning out the light, the date and the pasture condition, and 2 observations about the southeast corner of the east field that he was going to mention to Earl in the morning. He closed the notebook. In the morning, he would be at the farmhouse at 5:15. The work would be what it was. He would do it correctly. That was the whole of it. That had always been the whole of it. The previous 11 workers had each left for their own reasons, and Earl had thought about those reasons enough across the 4 years to understand what they had in common, which was that all 11 of them had come to the farm expecting something other than what it was. Some had expected an easier pace. Some had expected instructions that were offered rather than demonstrated once and then expected to be retained. Some had expected that correctly done and adequately done were the same thing, which Earl had found untrue in 44 years of farming, and did not intend to pretend otherwise for anyone's comfort. The expectation had not matched the reality, and when that happened, the person left, which was the correct outcome for everyone, including the person who left, because a mismatch between expectation and reality was something that got worse with time rather than better, when the underlying mismatch was about standards rather than skills. Curtis had not brought an expectation that did not match the reality. This was partly because he had described the reality clearly on the porch step that first morning, and partly because Curtis was a man whose relationship with work had always been one of full engagement rather than minimum adequate performance. And Earl's farm was an environment in which full engagement was not extraordinary, but was simply what the work required. The match had been there from the first fence post. Earl had thought about this match across 5 years with the specific analytical attention he brought to anything on the farm that worked well and that he wanted to understand so that he could continue to get it right. He thought the match had 2 components. The first was skill, not the skills of farming specifically, but the underlying skills of any work done correctly. The systematic attention and the respect for tools and the willingness to understand a system before modifying it, and the refusal to call something done when it was not yet done. Curtis had those skills from the machine shop. They transferred to the farm fully. The second component was harder to name. It was something about the specific need that each of them brought to the arrangement. Earl needed the work done correctly because the work being done correctly was the farm being what it was supposed to be, and the farm being what it was supposed to be was the thing he had given 44 years to, and that he was not going to stop caring about because his knee had given out, and the previous 11 people had found the standards inconvenient. Curtis needed the work to require correctness, because without that requirement, the skills had no place to go. And without a place to go, they did not exist in any functional sense. And without the functional existence of what you were good at, you were not fully yourself. The need and the skill had found each other on a porch step in April of 2019, and the 5 years since had been the result of that finding. Frank Gully had stopped by the farm in the spring of 2024, on a morning in May, to return a gate hinge he had borrowed the previous fall. Curtis was in the equipment shed doing the spring maintenance on the mower conditioner when Frank arrived, and Frank had watched him work for a few minutes before going to find Earl in the barn. He had said to Earl that the man had been here a while now. Earl had said 5 years. Frank had said that was longer than anyone had stayed before. Earl said yes. Frank had said he guessed the standards had not changed. Earl said no. He said the standards had not changed and would not change. Frank had thought about that for a moment. He said, so what was different about this one? Earl had looked at him for a moment and then had looked out the barn door toward the equipment shed where Curtis was working, and had said that what was different was that Curtis came to the farm already knowing that the standards were the point rather than the obstacle. He said most people who came looking for farm work came looking for a version of farm work that fit what they already knew, and that when the fit was not there, they moved on to find work that fit better. He said Curtis had not come looking for a fit. He had come looking for the work itself, for work that asked the most of what he had, and that did not accept less, and that was a different thing entirely. Frank had said he supposed that made sense. Earl had said it made sense to him. He said it had taken 5 years and 11 people to make the sense clear, which was longer than he would have chosen, but that the clarity was worth the time. Frank had nodded and had given Earl the gate hinge and had driven home, and Earl had gone back to the barn work. And in the equipment shed, Curtis had run the mower conditioner through its test cycle and found one adjustment that needed making and made it and run the cycle again and found it correct, and had noted both the finding and the correction in the maintenance log before moving to the next piece of spring equipment on the list. The log would join the 4 decades of records on the office shelf when this season was done. The shelf was getting full. They had talked about building a second set of shelves on the adjacent wall. Earl had said it could wait until winter when the inside work could be done without taking time from the field work. Curtis had said that was fine and had noted it in the winter projects list that he kept in the back of the current notebook. The farm did not wait for anyone, and no one on the farm waited for the farm. The work was what it was, and the season was what it was, and the standard was what it was. And the 2 men who managed the farm between them understood all 3 of these things in the same way, which was to say, completely and without negotiation. That was what 5 years had built between them. That was in the specific language of the work. What correctly done meant when it was applied to something larger than a fence post or a baler mechanism or a cattle rotation. It meant 2 people who understood what the thing required and who gave what was required without reservation, year after year, in the way that things that were worth doing got done when the people doing them understood what they were for. The fence post in the east pasture from the first morning was still plumb. Curtis had checked it in the fall of every year since, not because it needed checking, but because it was the first thing he had done correctly on the farm, and because the checking was a way of knowing where he had started and measuring what the years since had produced. It was plumb. It had been plumb from the first morning. That was the beginning of it. And the beginning of it had been correct, and everything that followed had grown from that.